How did it come to this? Why is it that I am once again forced to watch yet another empire fall? The Emperor had shattered time, space, and reality. This was supposed to be the last one, the eternal empire. So how is it that once more it is burning around me? Isaiah stood in the center of the command center itself. Various different support staff going to and fro, each and every single one of them doing their appointed tasks. There were only 3 other individuals in there with him of, at the very least, significant importance. These being none other than Lady Molly, Empress of the Sibberton Empire, and Lord Benimaru, one of the Sibberton Calamities, so called the Crimson Samurai. Isaiah was staring at the command console, watching as the war in the void played out, as more and more vessels were destroyed or infected, as the large island of violence that was the Dawn, the Asmodeus, and the Eye of Avarice. And yet, he could do nothing. Nothing but watch. He quickly played around with the console, bringing up the western wall, or at least the cameras that pointed outwards. The primary megacontinent that Austungrad was set upon didn't wholly consume all of the land. One of the most prominent areas was a relatively large peninsula out to the western side. It was here that he now saw a mountain of biomass gathering. It would not be long before the battle itself had begun. It would not be long until the first wall had fallen. The defenses were never designed to handle this type of situation. They were designed to ward off, not to fight a war of attrition. And yet, that is exactly what they would have to do. The Sibberton Empire, as brave as it wasn't going to be able to weather the storm. Even now, after so many years of preparation, there were still so many things to do. There were still so many things to set up for the battle to come. He had put out a notice a very long time ago. This notice was simple. It was informing the people of Austungrad that there was volunteer work at the front lines, at the first wall. He made it abundantly clear that only volunteers would be taken, and made it exceedingly clear as well that these individuals would likely not see another sunrise. They would not live to see their loved ones once more. They would not live to see the fate of the Empire, whether it be in victory or in ruin. Isaiah was utterly shocked when he saw the amount of people, both soldiers and civilians, that had applied for it, and had to carefully sort through it to choose the best of the best. The individuals who had the highest chance of holding the line for as long as possible. Lieutenant Strand was standing outside the first wall, specifically at the western gate, or at least close enough that he could see it. He looked out ahead of him and saw what the Blight Plague was doing to his home, to his world. He then looked alongside all of the soldiers next to him. There stood some of the best men and women he had ever served alongside. They called themselves the Mevalon 7th. Despite the fact that they weren't actually from Austungrad, they still saw it as their world, as their home. This was the final bastion of the Sibberton Empire, and Strand would be damned if he was not going to participate in the very first battles. Behind them was their light personnel carrier. It certainly wasn't as large or powerful as some of the other vehicles that other groups had brought with them, but it had gotten them through plenty of fights alive. The most important thing was this heavy plasmite cannon on top. It could easily saturate the area and force the Blight Plague back. Assuming there weren't too many of them, but Strand, nevertheless, was optimistic. As he had these thoughts, he continued to look out ahead of him, and he saw that it was finally starting. Wave after wave after wave of pure forms were starting to rush towards the front lines. Already, the mortars and direct fire cannons on top of the walls were firing, laying down heavy siege upon the front ranks. It would still be some time, however, before they got within weapons range, and as a result, he continued to prepare himself, checking over his weapons for what had to have been the 100th time. He looked out to his left and right and saw that the men and women under his command were doing the same. There was little to do. Very little to do, and so much anticipation. It didn't take long for the marksmen to start opening up. There weren't many along the entirety of the front line, but those that did have the accuracy and talent for such a thing were already opening up, picking off important targets, believed to be controlling the Blight Plague, although at this point nobody was entirely certain. Those types of details were for more important individuals. The rank and file had a simple job: hold the line. That's exactly what they were going to do. Whether it meant victory or death, not a single one of them cared. Not a single one of them would hesitate to sacrifice their lives if it meant that Austungrad could hold out for just a little bit longer. After all, each and every single one of them was optimistic. They had the Sibberton strategist on their side, the great Isaiah Tempra, Winter General of the Sibberton Empire. He surely still had a plan, still a strategy that he could deploy at the perfect time that would save Austungrad and the Sibberton Empire. There wasn't a single person along the front lines that wasn't confident in this fact. It certainly wasn't bad news that he hadn't brought out any information on this tactic, but that simply just meant that it was still being prepared. That didn't mean that there wasn't one at all. As Strond looked out, he saw that they were starting to get within weapons range. However, unlike some of the other commanders in the area, he told his soldiers to hold their fire. He wanted to wait until it was optimal range. He wasn't going to start firing the second that he could. He wanted to make sure to conserve as much ammo as possible. He was planning on the fact that they were going to burn through all of their ammo. They weren't going to receive reinforcements. They weren't going to receive any resupplies. And the gates, more or less, were going to stay sealed. They had to be careful. They had to be conservative with their ammunition. That being said, their armor transport had already started opening fire, laying down saturated fire across the entirety of their front lines. Strond had a thought. Did the Blight Plague get affected by saturated fire? He thought not. At this point, they were easily within range. He told his men to start opening fire. It was at this point that the siege was now in full effect. The battle had been going on for hours. Explosions everywhere. Rapid-fire energy bolts all across the front line in a desperate attempt to hold back the Blight Plague's forces. Every single man and woman that were posted there fighting for their lives. In some cases, fighting for the entirety of the Sibberton Empire. Their motives didn't exactly matter. What did matter is that they were about to receive a reinforcement from the most unlikely of locations. Many of the soldiers around the front gate looked in terror as suddenly the western gate was starting to rumble open. This wasn't part of the plan. The gate was meant to be sealed, permanently sealed. The Blight Plague would eventually find a way through. It always did, but at the very least it was going to be held back for a time. As the soldiers that were directly adjacent to it looked back, they saw something that they never would have expected to see. This wasn't some reinforcements that hadn't been allocated yet, nor was it some battalion that simply had just not arrived in time. This was somebody who probably gave an order out for themselves rather than anything else. A single individual, accompanied by two what appeared to be ghostly wolves by her side, was marching out from the gate already closing behind her, once more sealing itself. This was none other than one of the Sibberton commanders, although nobody was exactly certain why she was there. She had many titles, many names: the Huntress, the Beast. Perhaps the most famous was the White Wall. She was a beast folk, with brilliant white gleaming armor. the two spectral wolves by her side, and an absolutely titanic glaive in her hand. She simply stood at the gate, watching, looking over each and every single one of the soldiers to her left and right, watching their disciplined fire mow down the blight plague. She then looked out ahead and saw exactly what she was fearing the most. Leviathan wasn't holding anything back now. Its special infected were already on the move, multiple abominations. If Celestine had to guess, most likely 4 abominations in total, as well as an unknown amount of plague fathers and maybe even a necrosis. They were still too far away to truly tell what they were. Not only that, but their forms were so varied it was nearly impossible to tell what was what. She calmly walked over to the front lines and asked one of the soldiers if she knew an individual by the name of Lieutenant Strond. They didn't know where this lieutenant was, and as a result she continued to walk through the front lines until finally she got an answer that she was looking for. She followed the directions and found a small regiment, a small group of soldiers with a light armored carrier behind them. "Are you Lieutenant Strond?" Strond immediately turned around, astonished that there was anybody that was talking to him, let alone not firing, period. When he saw who it was, he immediately went to attention. "Aye, ma'am. How may I be of service?" "New orders have come in. You're to immediately retreat." "Retreat, ma'am?" "Yes, that's exactly what I told you. You have new orders. Go to the gate at once. They'll open it for you." Strond was utterly confused and, needless to say, quite furious. He was planning on standing by the men and women under his command. He was planning to fight and, if necessary, die by their side. He certainly was no coward, and he wasn't going to show cowardice on the battlefield by retreating. "Ma'am, is this absolutely necessary?" "It is. You have your orders. Go." With a declaration like that, Strond had very little to say. As a result, he packed up his weapon and his armor and his gear. The men and women under his command looked concerned, but he simply looked at them with a knowing smile. He had very little information that he could tell them. He started to fall back to the gate. He wasn't sure what was going on or why he was being requested by name, but the simple matter of the fact was that he wouldn't be able to fight by their sides anymore. He had hoped that before the first wall would fall, as it most likely would, that he'd be able to return to the front lines and fight by their side. This is utterly ridiculous. The Siritan Empress was going on a massive tirade, clearly annoyed by what she had seen. To be fair, Isaiah hadn't expected this either. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to order her back. At this point, there's little that I can do. You're well aware that she technically outranks me, and I outrank you. Call her back." Isaiah was having none of it. He already didn't respect the Siritan Empress, as he always saw her as trying to dodge her responsibilities. She was the Siritan Empress for the Empire's sake, and yet she considered studying her magic more important than taking up her responsibilities and roles as the Empress. Even now, he wasn't willing to indulge her. He had sent out Celestine with a very specific mission. He knew that Leviathan was going to throw a significant amount of heavy hitters at the first wall, specifically at the west. It needed to be held for as long as possible. The final assets on the second wall were finally being put in place, but they needed more time. And who better to give more time than one of the Siritan commanders? What he said to the Empress wasn't entirely wrong. Celestine had been serving for far longer than he had. As a result, she did technically outrank him, despite the fact that he was the Siritan strategist and in charge of the entire defense of Austungrad. But, of course, he wasn't willing to tell her that. He simply continued to ignore the Siritan Empress as she continued to complain and looked out across the battlefield. Just as predicted, Leviathan was starting to send in special infected, multiple abominations, plague fathers, and even a necrosis. And, if he had to guess, the massive protrusion coming from the blight plague biomass mountain most likely indicated the potential for a mutator. That wasn't going according to plan. But the simple matter of the fact is that they had a job and they had to hold the line. So, once more, he looked to Celestine. And it looked as if she was completely and utterly ready for the task at hand. Celestine continued to march forward, completely heedless of the soldiers around her calling for her to come back. She wasn't some recruit. She wasn't some new-faced soldier. She was a Civitan commander, and she could certainly fight and stand like one. Her 2 spectral wolves by her side. She knew that this was going to be a tough fight, but she was willing to go through with it anyway. It was time to show her resolve. All her life, her loyalties to the Civitan Empire, as well as her commitment to it, had always been questioned, solely due to her race. She hadn't decided to be born as a beast folk, but she had made the best of it that she could. She had a lot of respect within the Civitan Empire, but that was solely due to her own merit and proving herself. And now, it was time for her to prove herself once more. It was time to remember all of those who hated her why she was called the White Wall. Within a moment's notice, she charged forward, suddenly transforming into nothing more than a standard wolf on 4 legs, her armor flawlessly transforming with her. She charged forward with both of her spectral wolves, intent on taking the fight to the enemy. The standard pure forms wouldn't pose a challenge. In fact, they wouldn't even slow her down. The fact of the matter is that her armor was specifically tailored to ensure that their biomass wouldn't be able to touch her, wouldn't be able to infect her. Her job was simple. Take out the special infected before they can reach the walls. That being said, the strategist never said how many that she had to defeat. She decided that she was going to take down all of them. And if it caused her death, all the better. It would only solidify her loyalty and her commitment in the eyes of those that she actually cared of the opinions of. She knew that the Winter General was not going to stand for it. She knew that he was likely going to send somebody with enough firepower to drag her back. He knew that he was likely to send the Praetorian Guard. But that was all according to her plan. If she could actually force Isaiah's hand to draw her back with the Praetorian Guard, they could at the very least hold the line for a significant amount of time while they tried to get her aboard whatever vessel they had brought, whether that be an aircraft or simply a personnel carrier. All the while, they would be forced to fight. The fact of the matter is that Isaiah's plan didn't sit well. These were war heroes, legendary gods of war within the Civitan Empire. To have them hang back at the 4th wall as their final line of defense didn't sit right with her. Such powerful warriors should be on the front lines, making the difference in the battle. But she didn't have a say in it, so she would do the next best thing. She would force Isaiah's hand. As she got within range of the front ranks, she immediately called to both of her wolves. They immediately stopped sprinting and howled into the air. Suddenly, much smaller spectral wolves started to appear all around them. A quite literal pack of them charged forward, attacking the front lines and mowing them down. At this point, Celestine had transformed back into her more humanoid form, glaive in hand as she launched herself towards the first abomination. Normally, it would take an entire armored division to take down one of these behemoths. However, none of them had the power of a Civitan commander. With a single sweep of her glaive, she decapitated the first one, or at the very least, what appeared to have been decapitation. The simple matter of the fact is that when it came to the Blight Plague, it was wholly unknown whether or not such a thing would actually work in practice, due to the fact that they could survive without what was believed to be their heads. However, in this specific case, it appeared to be exactly that. The abomination quickly fell over backwards, crushing an untold amount of pure forms behind it. At the very least, the collateral damage was welcome. It would lessen the strain on the spectral wolves as they continued to fight on her behalf, continued to protect her from the swarms. The second abomination was suddenly directly above her. They were much faster when they were this close. Celestine immediately dodged to the side as it launched its boulder-sized fist into the ground, cracking it and making a massive crater. She immediately swept her glaive from left to right, cutting the leg in two. She then proceeded to spear it through the center. 2 down, 2 to go. However, she knew that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. The abominations were one thing. However, if Leviathan decided to throw out some heavier hitters, such as Plague Fathers or even the Necrosis, she would start to have a difficult time. So far, the Plague Fathers were far behind her. She had intentionally ignored them, knowing that the artillery of the walls would easily be able to take them down. They'd be a challenge for her to take on. Something as brutish and simple as abominations, however, being nothing more than muscle on muscle, that would be an easy challenge. She charged to the third one and once again took it down with ease. The fourth one, on the other hand, would prove significantly harder. Once more, she had hit the typical locations that would kill them in a single blow, yet this one continued to fight on, no matter how much damage it sustained. Clearly, this one was a cut above the rest. She called to her wolves, and they immediately swarmed it on all sides, bringing it down with sheer weight of numbers alone, as she continued to cut at it piece by piece, finally finding the specific part of it that would cause it to die. She felt proud of herself. Not only had she managed to take down 4 abominations on her own, but she was easily holding a large portion of the Blight Plague at bay thanks to her Wolf Pack spell. However, things would take a turn for the worst. Out of nowhere, a giant column of highly acidic bile exploded next to her, its aim ever so slightly off as she launched herself backwards. She was being ambushed by Plague Fathers. This would prove to be difficult. There were many reasons why the commander wasn't able to fight Plague Fathers. The fact that they could spew forth bile that could easily chew through her armor was just one of the reasons. It would appear as though Leviathan was significantly more annoyed with her than she had originally anticipated. As she looked around her, she realized that it wasn't just one Plague Father. It was multiple, completely surrounding her. She wasn't entirely certain how she didn't see it coming, let alone how they had managed to completely surround her. Was she seriously too focused on the abominations? She didn't know, and right now, she didn't care. She had far more pressing things on her mind. Out of nowhere, one of the Plague Fathers suddenly started getting blasted with multiple plasmite rounds to the face, or what could best be described as the face. As she looked behind her, she saw something that she wasn't expecting. The soldiers that were around that one lieutenant that she was told to take back to behind the first wall. She recalled that they were called the Mevalon 7th, and they were currently charging with their personnel carrier directly towards her. She realized at once what exactly they were trying to do. They were willing to sacrifice themselves just to protect her, just to keep her unharmed. It was a completely and utterly doomed charge. However, it gave her just enough breathing room to get out of the encirclement, as the Plague Fathers were instantly focused on them as the next aggressor. Managing to get behind multiple of the Plague Fathers and started to deal as much damage as she could before they rounded on her and started to attack her. She managed to take down 4 of them, but before the Mevalon 7th managed to get to them. The Mevalon 7th, under sustained fire, managing to take down 1 as well. It was just down to the final Plague Father. She was confident that she could take it down and were already telling her wolves to attack it. That's when everything changed. A massive roar erupted from the mountain. Celestine had looked back just in time to see a massive amount of Blight Plague biomass explode from the mountain in every single direction, as suddenly a giant black amorphous blob erupted from it, on a dead-set path directly towards Celestine. This was not something that she had accounted for. If she had to guess, it was likely a mutator. A mutator was well beyond what she was capable of handling, and with the Mevalon 7th by her side, they were pretty much all doomed. However, it was as if the Silverton Emperor himself was watching over them. She suddenly received a report within her comm system. A report from none other than the HMSS Asmodeus. Apparently somebody up there in the middle of a void war was watching the ground and noticed that Celestine was in a bit of a tight spot. They had informed her that they would be able to fire a single lance strike, as that's all that they could afford right now, given that their focus was so heavily turned towards the rest of Leviathan. She took what she could get, immediately telling them coordinates. Within an instant, it was as if the air around her was charged. She immediately pulled up a hand to the Mevalon soldiers, telling them to retreat. This was gonna be bad. Suddenly, small little bits of debris and tiny stones were levitating into the air, a telltale sign that a lance strike was incoming. One of her spectral wolves immediately arrived next to her as she hopped onto it, and the wolf immediately charging away from the area. The next instant, it was as if the world itself had ended. A cataclysmically massive beam of energy struck the mutator dead on, creating at the very minimum a stadium-sized crater in the ground. When the energy finally subsided, after having launched all parties into the air, the mutator was nowhere to be seen. She had gotten lucky, but it would not last. She glanced behind her and saw that the Blight Plague was already at the front lines, and the lines were already faltering. Multiple groups of soldiers had already been infected and were turning on their own. It would appear as though the wall was seconds away from collapse. That's when, once again, as if the Silverton Emperor were watching over her, she heard something that she never expected to hear. Gunfire. Very big gunfire. As she looked above, she saw something that was a sight for sore eyes, especially right now. It turned out that her gamble had worked. It was none other than a Vulcan gunship. A human-made ship that proved to be superior even to the Silverton Empire's aircraft. Massive plasma cannons located all across it, multiple missile silos, multiple missile pods under the wings that were unleashing hellish amounts of fire towards the front line, culling the Blight Plague as they continued to advance towards the walls. As it continued to lower itself to the ground, she heard but a single phrase. "Praetorians, march!" Suddenly, within an instant, 21 boots collided with the ground, each and every single one of them gleaming golden in the light. The Praetorian Guard, and most unexpectedly, the Silverton Supreme Commander, stood there, ready to fight. Once more, another mutator was coming from the mountain. Celestine wasn't exactly sure how they were going to take it down. The Praetorians were certainly powerful, but taking down a mutator was well beyond even their immense capabilities. However, it appears as though the Supreme Commander, Marcus Bain, already had a solution for this problem. He immediately sent over a data packet to Celestine as well as the Mevalon 7th, telling them to retreat. Meanwhile, Celestine was to come towards the Praetorian Guards and shelter behind them. She didn't ask them why. She simply charged towards them. As she got close to them, she saw that Marcus's void shield had lowered a little bit, allowing her to enter into it. She didn't question it and immediately got in, the void shield quickly reforming around her. "Praetorians! Barriers!" Within an instant, the void shields around each and every one of the Praetorian Guard turned completely black, small spheres of pure abyssal power. The next thing that she knew, the ground itself was shaking at an impossible level. A massive explosion of force hit the shields, and even Marcus was forced backwards ever so slightly, nearly colliding with Celestine. As the energy of the barrier subsided, she saw a massive explosion and mushroom cloud directly in front of him. She was utterly confused when suddenly yet another data pulse arrived on her inner helmet. It simply had one word: Queston. She wasn't entirely certain how or why the Siritan Supreme Commander had a Queston planet cracker, let alone where it was, but it certainly was helpful. It forced the mutator back, dealing critical amounts of damage, but not yet killing it. But that wasn't the intention. The intention was to force it back before it could do any appreciable damage. Yet another data burst. Marcus didn't have time to speak out loud. It simply said, retreat. Once more, the void shields opened up, and she immediately started running backwards. At this point, her objective was done. She had achieved what she wanted. The Praetorians were in the battle, and at the very least, they could hold the line for a substantial amount of time. At this point in the battle, nothing that Leviathan could throw at them would actually stop them. But once more, that didn't appear to be the Praetorians' goal. It seemed as though the Praetorians were solely there to retrieve Celestine and retreat, as they were now walking backwards in perfect lockstep with one another, mowing down hundreds, if not thousands, of blight plagues every single shot that was fired. Their massive, heavy Solstite cannons carving through the front lines of the blight plague, keeping them at bay. There was absolutely nothing save for special infected that could actually approach them, and as of currently, other than the mutator, there was nothing on the field currently. Leviathan was being unusually passive at this point. However, the Praetorians and Celestine took what they could get. They continued to retreat, until finally they had made it back to the first wall. The Vulcan gunship was already sitting on the ground, waiting, continuing to fire its heavy plasma cannons on the front towards the incoming blight plague. Celestine knew that she wasn't going to be able to get away with anything else. She boarded the gunship and was immediately followed by the Supreme Commander and the Praetorian Guard before it took off. Their objective wasn't to assist on the front line. Their objective was to get an unruly commander back safely, as her loss at this point would be a crippling blow to the morale of the Siritan Empire. As the back hatch of the Vulcan gunship slowly closed, she looked down below her and saw the front lines being completely and utterly overwhelmed. With the lack of the Praetorian Guard and the Vulcan gunship to hold back the swarm, they ran over each and every single one of the soldiers. To their credit, not a single one broke, not a single one panicked. They shot till the end. It was at this point that Isaiah had sent a broadcast to the entirety of Austungrad. The first wall has fallen.